we will now proceed to the last part of this chapter, which is testing and debugging functions. Of course, when you are doing programming, it is important that you must first test and debug your program. And of course, breaking it down into components. Of course, that comes down to the testing and debugging of your functions. So of course, that can actually be done individually. You can actually test and debug your functions individually, and there are ways to do that. So we must remember that each function should be tested as a separate unit. Of course, before we combine all our function as a part of a huge application or a program, it only makes sense that should be first tested and debugged. And testing individual functions facilitates finding mistakes. So if you were able to capture error at the module level, so at least that you are assured that you will have a properly functioning program. So for that purpose, we can actually use driver programs which will allow us to test individual functions. So once a function is tested, it can be used in the driver program to test other functions. So we have here an example. So in program 4.10, we actually created this as a driver program for the function getInput. So in this case, our intention to write a driver program is to test a single function. So as you can see here, the only function that we are dealing with in this particular program is the getInput function. So for example, we would like to test how this function actually works. So all we need to do is, of course, we must specify the precondition and the post condition and try to see if the function behaves in the manner that we expect. Okay? So anyway, there's nothing special about this particular program, only that it shows us how to create a driver program which has the intention of testing a single function. So in this case, the getInput function. So anyway, let's try uh, running it. Okay. So let's see how it goes. Okay, so anyway, let's just enter a new value. And that is the output. Okay, so that's a demonstration of how you can write a driver program for testing your functions individually. Next, we also have what we call stubs. So when a function is being tested, calls to other functions that are not yet tested, we can use a stub. So in this case, a stub is actually a simplified version of a function. So usually it's not yet completed, but for the purpose of testing some other functions, we need to include it in a program. So therefore, we implement it as a stub. So they usually provide values for testing rather than performing the actual calculation. So they should be so simple that you have confidence that they will perform correctly. So for this particular purpose, that you're just going to test a function, other functions, which we'll call a stub function. So you can simply put a constant value for that. So anyway, here's an example of how we can use a stub to test our program. Here it is. Okay. So in this case, we would like to test our program. So for example, our supermarket program or whatever you want to call it. So as you can see here, the following are the functions that will compose our program with their corresponding post condition and precondition. Okay. where it applies. Okay. And if you will notice, of course, in our main function, that's where we call our functions. The void, the introduction function has been defined, it has been implemented. Same also with get input, same also with give output. And let's take a look at the price function. So in this case, this is only a stub. Okay, what do we mean here? What we mean here is that it does not necessarily provide the correct calculation, but at the minimum, it is a running function. Okay, it is running, it is executable, and its sole purpose is to test the program. So what we did here is actually not an actual calculation, but we simply put here a constant value that should be returned after each execution. So that is for the purpose of testing. Okay? In this case, everything should be compiled, everything should be correct as far as syntax goes, and we just want to test how the entire program should work once it is running. So since we can assume that, for example, this particular function is not yet complete, it is not yet properly implemented, so we just implement it as a stub and then just put here a simple statement that will serve for this testing purpose. Okay, so let's run this example. Of course, as expected, this should run because this is only a test program, and one of the functions was implemented as a stub function to satisfy the requirements of testing this particular program. So anyway, I'll just input any values here, and that's it. So this is how you write a stub program. Next. So what are the rules for testing functions? So these are the fundamental rules for testing your function. So you should test every function in a program in which every other function in that program has already been fully tested and debugged. So as you have seen in our examples, it is possible and quite a good practice to test your functions individually. So the moment you test them, of course, the debugging process also follows. So there are different ways to do that, and of course we showed them how to use a driver program to test each function, and at the same time you can combine all your functions to test the entire program. And of course, if in cases where some of the functions are not yet complete, then you can simply implement them as a stub function and provide them with the value that would at least let them execute on their own, and therefore allow your program to be tested. So that would be it for this topic, which is the last topic for chapter 4. So this topic, it is expected that you are now able to describe the fundamental rules for testing functions. You're also expected to know how to write a driver program, as well as to define what a driver program is. And of course, you're also expected to know and how to use a stub. And finally, to implement your own stub to test your program, even with still incomplete functions. Okay, so that would be it for chapter 4. So I hope you do all the exercises that were provided to you, and of course I'll also be waiting for your comments, for your questions, or any concerns that needs to be addressed via our Google Classroom as well as our Facebook page. So again, have a good day and thank you so much. Keep safe.